Back off. Cleo Marchand said it without thinking. The way you say something when your body has already decided, and your brain is still catching up. There were 5 of them. Big men in worn cuts standing in a loose half-circle near the far pumps at the Petro-Canada on Loyalist Parkway. An older man was on the ground between the pumps and the curb, one hand flat on the pavement trying to get himself upright. His motorcycle lay on its side 12 feet away, oil spreading slow from the engine, dark against the pale concrete. Nobody else in the lot was moving. 3 cars at the pumps, a woman near the entrance with a bag, a teenage boy frozen by the air machine, all of them watching, none of them moving. Cleo grabbed the lug wrench from the bed of her truck without deciding to. Her hands knew tools the way some people knew words, reflexively without consultation. She was 26 years old, 125 pounds, alone in a gas station lot in Millhaven, Ontario at 8:20 on a Tuesday night, and she walked toward them anyway. Back off, she said again, louder this time. 5 heads turned. The one in front was big through the shoulders, jaw like poured concrete, eyes that took a moment to process what they were seeing. He looked at her, looked at the wrench, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement but was close enough to be offensive. Little girl, he said, you sure about this? Cleo planted her feet. She could feel her hands shaking where they gripped the wrench, but her voice was holding. It had held before, it would hold now. I'm sure, she said. She had no plan. She was honest enough to acknowledge that to herself. She had a wrench and a voice that wasn't cracking, and the knowledge clear and absolute, that she was not going to walk back to her truck and pretend she hadn't seen this. Her father had raised her knowing the difference between a moment that mattered and one that didn't. This one mattered. The man on the ground looked up at her. He was maybe 65, silver-haired, with a vest that had seen decades of road and eyes that hadn't lost their clarity, despite whatever had just happened to him. He was holding his ribs. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not fear, not gratitude yet, but something sharp and assessing. You don't have to do this, he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. I know, Cleo said. She kept her eyes on the 5, but I'm going to anyway. The big one took a half step forward. Then a voice came from the direction of the Tim Hortons across the street. A woman, older, phone raised. I've got all 5 of you on camera. The big one looked at the woman, looked back at Cleo. Something shifted in the calculation behind his eyes. Let's go, said a voice from the back of the group. They went. Not fast. They moved the way men move when they want it, understood their choosing to leave, but they went. Cleo stood with the wrench in both hands until 2 sets of taillights disappeared around the bend on Loyalist Parkway. Then she let her breath out. It came out ragged and long, like something held too tight for too long. Her knees wanted to fold. She didn't let them. She turned and crouched beside the man on the ground. Let me look at your ribs, she said. I'm fine. You're guarding your left side like you're not fine. He looked at her for a moment and then something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Cracked, maybe. Wouldn't be the first time. His name was Wallace Stanhope. He told her this when she helped him sit upright, the same matter-of-fact way she introduced herself. Cleo Marchand, Marchand Auto on County Road 7. She righted his bike the way she righted every broken thing, quickly, efficiently, reading the damage without drama. The primary seal had a slow leak that had nothing to do with what had just happened tonight. That needs proper attention, she said, nodding at the engine. The mechanic I was heading to see has probably closed up by now. Marchand Auto on County Road 7, she said again. He raised an eyebrow. That's my shop, she said. Open at 7:30. She'd inherited Marchand Auto 19 months ago, when her father Raymond died of a heart attack in the middle of changing a transmission on a '99 Silverado. 54 years old, no warning. There one moment and then not. Raymond Marchand had built the garage from nothing over 22 years. A single bay in a rented space that grew into a 4-bay operation on a piece of land he'd saved for and bought outright when Cleo was in primary school. She'd grown up in that garage. She'd learned to read an engine before she could read cursive. When Raymond died, there was no question of selling. There was no version of that story she could live inside. What there was in the 19 months since was a list of problems that kept getting longer and never seemed to get shorter. 3 of Raymond's long-standing commercial accounts had canceled inside her first year. The Ridgeview Township fleet contract, 8 years running, had gone to a shop 2 towns over, citing restructuring. A dealership in Napanee she'd been servicing since before her father passed stopped calling after their service manager changed. The regional ambulance depot let her go without explanation. Each cancellation arrived with polite, vague language that gave her nothing to push against. She'd told herself it was the transition. New owner, new relationships to build. People had trusted Raymond, not just the shop. She needed to earn what he'd been given. She'd almost started to believe that story. Wallace Stanhope arrived at 7:45 the next morning. He wasn't alone. He came with 2 others. One was a compact man in his late 50s with a close gray beard and the patient eyes of someone who'd learned long ago that most situations resolved themselves if you gave them enough room. He introduced himself as Patrick Sullivan, though everyone, it became clear, called him Sully. The other was younger, maybe 40, with a watchful quiet that felt active rather than passive, the quiet of someone who was always listening more carefully than he appeared to be. His name was Graeme Lefebvre. His vest had a patch that read Iron Brotherhood MC above a road curving toward a setting sun. Cleo knew the Iron Brotherhood by name. Her father had serviced two of their members over the years and had always been matter-of-fact about it. Motorcycle clubs, Raymond had said, were like any other trade. There were men who did the work honestly and men who didn't, and you judged them by which kind they were. The Iron Brotherhood, as far as she'd ever heard, were the first kind. She got to work on Wallace's bike. The seal was worse than she'd clocked the night before, and while she was in there, she found a brake line showing early wear and a fork seal starting to weep. She talked through each finding as she went, not performing competence, but having it. And she was aware in the background of her focus that all three men were watching the way people watch someone who knows what they're doing and has stopped needing to announce it. When she laid out the full scope and quoted a number, Wallace didn't flinch. He said, "When can you have it done?" "Tomorrow afternoon." "Good." He looked at her steadily. "While I'm here, would you be willing to show me your books?" Cleo set down the socket wrench. "Why?" she asked. "Because there's a look people get when they're carrying something they can't put down," Wallace said. "You've had it since last night." "I don't need charity." "I didn't offer any. I asked to see your books." She looked at him, at Sully and Graeme standing behind him, not pressuring, not performing patience, just present, the way men are present when they've decided something is worth waiting for. She went and got the files. It took Wallace 35 minutes to go through what had taken Cleo 19 months to stop losing sleep over. He read quietly, thoroughly, without expression. Sully leaned in once and pointed to something on a page. Graeme had his arms folded, reading from where he stood. When Wallace looked up, something had settled in his face that hadn't been there before. Something focused and very still with an edge beneath it. "Who is Northgate Property Group?" he asked. The question landed somewhere behind Cleo's sternum. "They've approached me twice," she said carefully. "A letter first, then in person. A man named Douglas Pratt, both times they wanted to buy." "You said no." "I said no." Wallace looked at Sully. Sully said, "We've seen this pattern before. Not from these people specifically, but from this type." He said it the same way he said everything, evenly, without drama. They identify a property corridor they want. Usually, there's something underneath the acquisition that makes it worth considerably more than the individual properties suggest. Development rights, proximity to infrastructure. Then they do the math on what it would cost to buy cleanly versus what it would cost to make those purchases easier first. Cleo felt the hair rise on her arms. "Making it easier how?" she asked. Graeme said from the wall, "Clients stop coming in, accounts cancel. A complaint surfaces from somewhere you can't locate. An inspection gets triggered from a filing you didn't know was made. Nothing dramatic, just friction. Enough friction over enough time. And a business that was running fine 3 years ago starts looking like it's in trouble. The owner, who's been carrying all of it for 2 years, starts looking at the offer on the table and thinking maybe it's time to cut losses." The garage was very quiet. Cleo sat down on the rolling stool near the toolbox. She sat because her legs had made that decision for her. "My father lost 3 fleet accounts in his last year," she said. Her voice had gone somewhere strange level, but strange. "He thought it was the transition economy, the recession hangover. He thought he'd done something wrong, missed something, let something slip." She stopped, looked at the floor. He spent the last 14 months of his life thinking he'd failed a business he'd built from nothing. Wallace was watching her. "Was that them?" she asked. "Was that already happening to him?" "I don't know yet," Wallace said, "but I intend to find out." The mechanic who had spent 19 months trying to hold together what her father had built was only now beginning to understand that the most important broken thing in her world had not broken by accident. She didn't cry. She'd gotten good at not crying in the 19 months since Raymond's funeral. There was too much to manage, too many creditors, too many decisions that arrived daily and did not wait for grief to finish its business. She'd learned to take the waves when they came and let them move through her and keep working. But this one was different because it wasn't grief. Grief she understood. Grief was clean in its terrible way. This was something else. This was discovering that the story she'd been carrying for 19 months, the story of her father who had somehow let his business slide, who had somehow missed a turn, was a lie, someone else's lie, placed inside her like a stone. She made coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. She made enough for 4 and put it on the workbench, and nobody said anything for a while. Her father's files were in 4 bankers' boxes in the back of the storage room. She'd opened them once in the spring after he died, and hadn't been able to stay inside them for long. She brought them out now. She set them on the shop floor and opened the first box, and her father's handwriting looked back at her from the first page. Neat and slanted, the handwriting of a man who believed that how you wrote something said something about how seriously you meant it. She sat down on the concrete and started reading, and stopped caring that Wallace and Graham were watching her. The records went back further than she'd remembered. Customer logs, yes, but also observations. Raymond had always written things down when they felt important, a habit Cleo had teased him about when she was a teenager, and understood now was simply the way his mind kept itself honest. Notes about municipal decisions affecting his property taxes, an entry about a vehicle that had parked across from the garage twice in 1 week, the driver getting out to photograph the building from different angles, a clipped article from the Kingston Whig Standard about a development proposal along Highway 38, noted without comment but folded and kept. And then, near the bottom of the second box, a letter. Northgate Property Group, clean letterhead. An offer to purchase Marchand Auto dated 22 months before Raymond died. The number was lower than what Pratt had brought Cleo, considerably lower. Paperclipped to the back was her father's handwritten draft of a response. 3 sentences. Mr. Pratt, thank you for your inquiry about Marchand Auto. It is not for sale. It will not be. And below that, in smaller writing, almost like talking to himself, find out who else they've approached. Find out what's underneath it. Cleo sat on the concrete floor of her father's garage with his words in her hands. The refrigerator hummed. The fluorescent over the second bay buzzed the way it had been buzzing for 3 weeks. A transport truck downshifted on County Road 7 outside. Her father had known something was wrong. He had been trying to find the shape of it, and then he died before he could. She looked up at Wallace. He was already looking into them, she said. Wallace crossed the floor in 3 strides and crouched beside her and read the letter. When he stood, something had moved into his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something older and very still. Green, he said. Yeah, Graham said quietly. He'd already seen it from where he was standing. We're going to need more people. The other business owners along Highway 38 weren't hard to find. What was hard was what she found when she sat across from them. Carl Whitman had run Whitman Hardware on the east end of the highway for 19 years, past tense. He'd sold 14 months ago to a numbered company he'd believed was a local investor. He sat across from Cleo at a Deseranto diner table with coffee he couldn't drink and hands folded flat on the tabletop, and told her that 3 of his major contractor accounts had canceled inside of 2 months, that an anonymous Better Business Bureau complaint had cost him a lawyer he couldn't afford, and 2 months of distraction he couldn't spare, and that by the time the offer came, he'd been too exhausted to fight anymore. I knew something was wrong, he said. I just couldn't find anything solid enough to grab. It was all smoke. Bette Nadeau had run a diner on the highway for 11 years before losing her 2 largest catering contracts inside a single quarter. She was still open, barely on loyal regulars, and a stubbornness she described without any apology as the best thing her mother ever gave her. She had a folder on the table before Cleo even sat down. I've been keeping this for 3 years, Bette said, because I knew something was wrong, and I knew no one official was going to listen to me. I thought someday I might need to show someone. The folder was meticulous. Cancellation notices with the specific language highlighted, always vague, always professional, always impossible to argue with. A note about a conversation with her building's landlord, who had mentioned being approached by a company he couldn't recall the name of. Odessa Gingras had closed her bookkeeping office on the highway 18 months ago, telling herself it was the market shifting, that it was simply time. She had not told anyone about the unsigned letter, suggesting a formal complaint was being prepared against her practice. The complaint never materialized. By then, it hadn't needed to. Pete LaCroix had sold his small engine repair shop 4 years ago to a buyer he'd liked personally. They'd gone fishing twice together. Graham traced the sale through 2 numbered companies to Northgate's holding structure in less than an afternoon. When Cleo told Pete as gently as she could what she'd found, he sat down on the step of his porch and didn't speak for almost a full minute. I thought he was a decent man, Pete said finally. He may believe he is, Graham said. It wasn't meant as comfort, but it was honest, and Pete seemed to receive it as such. Can you still use me? I already sold. Yes, Cleo said, we can use you. He looked up at her, and something moved across his face. The particular shift of someone who has been alone with a shameful thing long enough that the relief of finally speaking it and the anger of finally naming it arrived together, neither one quite fitting through the door first. Then I'm in, he said. What Cleo understood, driving back to Millhaven that evening, was that each of them had carried a version of the same story alone for years, and each of them, without knowing the others, were doing the same. had wondered at some point whether the pattern was real or whether they'd constructed it from bad luck and the human need to find shapes in chaos. Whether they were, at the end of it, simply people who hadn't been good enough. That was the cruelest part of how it worked. They didn't just take the business. They made you believe you'd caused it yourself. The name that stopped Cleo cold came on a Thursday afternoon. Graham spread corporate registry documents across her workbench. Northgate Property Group's holding structure, pulled from provincial records, layered and deliberately obscure, and pointed to a name listed as a silent director of the numbered company 2 tiers above the acquisition arm. Hugh Bellamy. Hugh Bellamy had managed her father's business accounts for 16 years. He had sat 2 pews behind them at Raymond's funeral and shaken Cleo's hand afterward and said, in a voice roughened by what she'd taken for genuine grief, "Your dad was the most honest man I ever did business with." He reviewed Cleo's books every 6 months. He knew exactly how much pressure she could absorb before she broke. "He controls your debt," Wallace said quietly when Cleo told him. "He always has." She stood at her workbench and thought about Hugh Bellamy, sitting across from her twice a year asking how things were going, and knowing what they were doing to her accounts, knowing what they'd done to her father's accounts, nodding and saying the market was tough right now, and wasn't she holding up remarkably well? "He was at my father's funeral," she said. "I know." He shook my hand. "Cleo." Wallace's voice was steady. "Don't go near him. Don't call. Don't change anything about how you normally deal with him. He cannot know we have this." What she wanted to do was drive to Bellamy's office on Ontario Street and put her father's letter on his desk and watch his face. What she said was, "How long?" "Not long," Wallace said. "Your father did most of the groundwork. We're standing on what he built. We just need to finish it." The lawyer Wallace brought in was a woman named Fiona Drummond, who drove up from Kingston on a Thursday evening in a car that had seen better winters and with a briefcase that clearly hadn't, and who looked at the assembled group, Cleo, Wallace, Sully, Graham, and 2 other Brotherhood men who'd arrived the day before, with the calm of someone who had worked in complicated rooms, and was not impressed by complication. "Walk me through everything," she said. They walked her through it. She listened without interrupting for 40 minutes, which Cleo appreciated. When they finished, Fiona set her pen down. "You have enough for a civil action against Northgate and the connected entities," she said. "For criminal exposure, you need someone inside the structure to talk." A pause. "The most immediate threat is your loan. If Bellamy triggers an early review and calls the note, you're in a very difficult position, regardless of what else we're building." "So we file first," Cleo said. "We file a motion asserting predatory lending based on the conflict of interest Bellamy has," Fiona said. "It won't win immediately, but it ties up any action on the note while the motion is pending." She looked at Wallace. "It also tells Bellamy we know." "We're past the point where concealment serves us," Wallace said. "If he knows, he has 2 choices, pull back or move against Cleo in a way that now looks like retaliation inside an active legal proceeding. Either way, we're better positioned than we were." "And everything gets copied tonight," Cleo said. "Everything I have, everything Bet has, everything my father left." Fiona looked at her steadily. "You've done this kind of thinking before." "I grew up in a garage," Cleo said. "You learn to document everything. You learn that broken things don't explain themselves." They worked until after 11. Fiona went through each piece of evidence with the precision of someone who understood that in the coming months, these papers would need to hold weight in rooms that didn't care about the human cost of what they contained. Sully made copies, physical and digital, distributed to 3 separate locations. Graham made calls she wasn't privy to, and by 9 he'd confirmed that records related to Northgate's corporate structure were being held by 2 people outside the province, whose names she wasn't given, but whose reliability Wallace vouched for without being asked. When Fiona stepped outside to make a call, Cleo found herself alone at the workbench, with the last of her father's files in front of her. She'd been through them so many times in the past 4 days she'd nearly memorized them. But she kept returning to the last line of his handwritten note, the one he'd written to himself below the 3-sentence response to Pratt. "Find out who else they've approached. Find out what's underneath it." He'd been that close. Close enough to ask the right questions, visit the right people, begin building what she was now finishing. He'd simply run out of time. She heard Wallace behind her and didn't turn. "He would have been good at this," she said. "He was good at it," Wallace said. "He got further than most people would have." Douglas Pratt came on a Tuesday evening, 40 minutes after she'd officially closed. She heard his car, expensive, quiet, the sound of money that had long stopped noticing itself, and heard it park, and heard footsteps that were deliberate without being hurried. The footsteps of a man who had done difficult conversations before and found a way to be comfortable in them. She was at the workbench when he knocked at the side door. She waited 4 seconds, then she opened it. Douglas Pratt was 61, well-dressed in the way of a man who understood that presentation was a form of pressure, with an easy posture and a smile calibrated for reassurance. He looked at her, at the garage, at the walls her father had built and she had kept, and his expression said he'd expected something smaller. "Mrs. Marchand," he said, "I apologize for the hour. I was hoping to catch you before you finished up for the day." "Mr. Pratt," she said, not a question, not surprise. She stepped back and let him in. He got to the point the way people do when they've prepared an approach and want it to seem spontaneous. He'd heard there had been some legal activity related to her business loan. He'd heard she'd been asking questions about the Highway 38 corridor. He wanted a direct conversation because he thought some of what she'd been told might be incomplete. "Tell me your version," Cleo said. "I'll tell you where it lines up with what I know." She watched him recalibrate. She was younger than he'd expected, or steadier, or both. He'd come here anticipating grief and financial exhaustion and had found something else entirely. He said the Highway 38 development was a legitimate project. Good for the county, good for jobs and tax revenue. He said it required a continuous commercial corridor, and that Marchand Auto sat at the geographic center of that corridor. "I know," she said. He blinked. "Which is why you've spent 3 years systematically dismantling the businesses around it," she said. "I understand that very well." The smile held, everything behind it evaporated. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "It's a documented fact," Cleo said. "I have my father's records going back 2 years before he died. I have the corporate registry documents connecting Northgate to 4 other acquisitions along this highway. I have statements from 5 business owners describing the same pattern of account cancellations, anonymous complaints, and regulatory pressure applied at staggered intervals as though each one was started on a schedule." She let her eyes stay on his face. "And I have the record of Hugh Bellamy's directorship in your holding company, which means the man who has held my family's financial records for 16 years has been using them to calibrate exactly how much pressure to apply." Pratt was very still. "You drove past this garage twice yesterday," Cleo said. "You didn't need to come here tonight. The legal motion will run its course. So I want to understand what you actually came here to say." Something closed off behind his eyes. He'd come with a plan, and the plan had stopped working 90 seconds ago, and he was genuinely uncertain in a way he didn't often get to be. "I came to make you a real offer," he said finally. "Fair market value, plus a settlement amount that addresses any concerns you may have about how the process was managed." He named a number. She had to acknowledge this honestly, a real number. Not insulting. A number that would have solved every financial problem she had and several she hadn't had yet, and that would have felt 6 months ago like being rescued. She thought about 3 sentences in her father's handwriting. "It is not for sale, it will not be." "No," she said. He looked at her. The last calculation ran behind his eyes. "You should think carefully," he said. It was the shape of a warning, worn smooth. The shape of a threat that had never needed to be anything more explicit, because up until now it had always worked. The bay door opened behind him. Wallace walked in, Sully behind him, Graham behind Sully, and behind Graham 2 men from the Brotherhood who stood without speaking, without posturing, with the particular stillness of people who had been somewhere before and understood that presence was enough. Pratt turned, looked at them, turned back to Cleo. "Good night, Mr. Pratt," she said. He left. Nobody said anything for 10 full seconds after his car cleared the lot. Then Graham, who had a small recorder in his jacket pocket, held it up. "Every word," he said. Fiona Drummond, who had been standing behind the far truck for the entire conversation, stepped forward. Her pen was already moving. "The comment about thinking carefully," she said, "combined with the evidence from Bellamy and the pattern documentation. That's not ambiguous. That's a pattern of conduct." She looked at Cleo. "We file with the provincial AG's office tomorrow morning. Everything. Your father's records, Bedett's folder, the corporate registry documents, the statements from all 5 business owners, and tonight's recording. All of it together." "And Bellamy?" Cleo asked. "Bellamy's regulatory exposure is separate from any criminal question," Fiona said. "The conflict of interest alone is a fiduciary violation. When the AG's office receives the package, they'll open a review. His position will become untenable." Cleo sat down on the stool by the workbench. She put both hands flat on the worn wood surface. The surface her father had set himself, the surface with the particular dents and stains of 22 years of work done honestly for people who needed it done right, and she felt the solidity of it. "He offered me real money," she said, "and for about half a second I felt the weight of it." "That's normal," Fiona said. "I know it's normal," Cleo said. "I'm not ashamed of it. I just want to say it plainly so it's honest." She looked at Wallace. "My dad would have done the same thing." Felt the weight for half a second and then said no. "Yes," Wallace said, "he would have." "How do you know?" she asked. "You never met him." "Because he left the letter," Wallace said quietly. Because he drove that highway with his recorder and his questions and his careful handwriting, going to every person he could find, not to protect his own property value, but because someone was lying to people who trusted them and he could not let that go. A pause. Men who are going to take the money don't build the case first. She called all 5 of them that night. She called Carl first. "It's moving," she said when he answered. "We file tomorrow. You're not in this alone." His silence on the other end said everything. His voice couldn't quite manage yet. She called each of them in turn. By the time she finished, Graham had made coffee that nobody had asked for and everyone wanted, and the garage held the particular quiet of a place where a decision has been made, and the work of carrying it out is about to begin. She thought about the 5 of them, going to bed tonight knowing something they hadn't known this morning, that the thing done to them had a name, that the people responsible were being held to account, that they hadn't been alone even when they'd felt most alone. They just needed someone to step forward first. Hugh Bellamy cooperated when the provincial regulatory body came for him. He provided documentation of every contact with Northgate's principals, every record he'd shared, every point at which he'd used his knowledge of the Marchand accounts to help calibrate the pressure strategy. And at the end of his formal statement, his lawyer communicated that Hugh Bellamy wished to provide a written personal statement to the Marchand family. Cleo read it once, standing at her workbench alone on a Thursday afternoon in November. The maples along County Road 7 bare by then, and the cold settled in for good. She didn't read it again. What she took from it were 2 things. The first was that Hugh Bellamy had understood what he was doing at every step. The investigation had not created that understanding. It had simply required him to say it out loud. The second was a single passage near the end. "Your father came to see me approximately 14 months before he passed. He said he'd noticed a pattern along Highway 38 and wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual in my business clients. I told him no. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, 'I think someone is making people feel like they failed when they didn't, Hugh. I think that's the part I can't leave alone.' He left shortly after. I said nothing. I have thought about that conversation more than I can say." Cleo stood with that for a long time. Her father had sat across from the man working against him and named it precisely. Someone is making people feel like they failed when they didn't, and had given him the chance to say something, had given everyone a chance, every time. That was who Raymond Marchand had been. He never assumed the worst until the worst proved itself, because he understood that assuming the worst about a person cost you the ability to be surprised by the best, and he had never been willing to pay that cost. She was his daughter in that way. She understood it now in a way she hadn't before. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in the top drawer of the tool cabinet, the one that locked, the one her father had kept for things that needed to be safe, and she locked it and went back to work. Douglas Pratt accepted a settlement 6 weeks after the AG filing. He signed a formal written acknowledgement of the targeting scheme, not corporate language, not passive construction, but plain sentences naming what Northgate Property Group had done and to whom. It had been Bette Nadeau's condition, which Cleo had adopted for all of them. Acknowledgement first, money second, because the money addressed the damage, but the acknowledgement addressed the lie. And the lie was the cruelest part, the slow and patient lie that had made Raymond Marchand spend the last months of his life thinking he'd failed the thing he'd built. That had made Pete Lacroix carry shame that was never his to carry. That had made each of them, alone, separately, without knowing the others were doing the same, wonder whether the pattern was real or whether they'd invented it out of bad luck. Carl Whitman called the evening the settlement was finalized. "I'm reopening," he said, "smaller than before, but mine. My son's coming in with me." Cleo said, "Your father would be proud of you." Then she stopped. "Sorry, I don't know if your father—" "He built the first location with me," Carl said. "Yeah, he would be." A pause. "Your father would be proud of you too," Carl said. She didn't try to speak for a moment. She looked at the workbench, at the walls, at the tools hanging in the order Raymond had hung them. "I know," she said. On the last evening of October, when the maples along County Road 7 had gone full and red, and the air had the particular quality it gets in Ontario, just before the cold settles in for the season, Wallace Stanhope pulled into the Marchand Auto lot one last time before heading west. He came alone. He parked and walked into the shop and didn't say anything at first. He looked at the walls and the workbench and the tools hanging in their order, and whatever he saw in those things seemed to satisfy something in him he didn't name. "Pratt took a plea," Cleo said. "She was under a dodge and she rolled herself out to say it properly. Bellamy's regulatory hearing is in January." "I know," Wallace said. She stood and wiped her hands on the rag tucked in her back pocket. Same motion, same pocket as her father every single day, and looked at him. "That night at the Petro-Canada," she said, "when I walked toward those 5 men, were you afraid? For yourself, I mean, when you were on the ground." Wallace considered it the way he considered most things, honestly, without rushing. No, he said. I've been in worse. I was more angry than afraid. He paused, but when you walked toward them, 26 years old, a lug wrench, no plan, I was scared for you, for about 4 seconds. What happened after 4 seconds? You planted your feet, he said, and I stopped being scared. Cleo looked at the garage. At the concrete her father had poured himself on a weekend in October 22 years ago, with 3 friends and a rented mixer. At the walls he'd built straight and solid on a piece of land he'd saved for over 3 years. At the workbench he'd set into the floor himself. At the tools he'd collected over 2 decades of doing honest work for people who needed it done right. She thought about 5 people sitting around a table in Deseronto, their faces in the light, looking at her with an expression she still didn't have a precise word for. Something between relief and recognition. The look of people who had been in the dark for a long time and were finally in a lit room together. She thought about her father driving Highway 38 with his recorder and his careful questions, visiting each person one by one, building what he could build with the time he had, leaving in the end a foundation solid enough that she'd been able to stand on it and finish what he'd started. She thought about a Petro-Canada parking lot at 8:20 on a Tuesday night, an old biker on the ground, 5 men standing over him, everyone watching and no one moving. 5 seconds to decide. She picked up her wrench and got back under the Dodge. Marchand Auto on County Road 7 in Millhaven, Ontario was not for sale. It had never been for sale. Raymond Marchand had built it from nothing on a piece of land he'd believed in, and his daughter had held it and fought for it and carried his work across the finish line he hadn't lived to reach. And now every business along Highway 38 knew it, every shuttered front and reopened door and person who had sat alone for years with something they'd been made to believe was their failure, and had finally learned the truth. The garage held the sounds it had always held, the particular language of a place where things were built and fixed and kept running by someone who understood that broken things did not repair themselves. Someone had to be willing to step forward first.